When my father looked at me that night, I knew he didn't see me, only the space I took up at his table. It wasn't new. It had been that way for years. Every dinner, every celebration, every speech that began with my son and ended before it ever reached me. I learned how to smile at the right moments, how to swallow words that would have only made things worse. I told myself silence was strength, that one day he'd notice without me having to beg for it. But silence doesn't earn you a seat. It just teaches people you'll never ask for one. So when he raised his glass again that night and said, "To the men who kept our waters safe," I didn't look away. I just sat there, steady, quiet, and finally understood something simple and sharp. They would never see me unless the truth forced them to. And it will. They just don't know it yet. Charleston looked the same as the day I'd left it. Too proud to change. Too polished to admit how much time had passed. The afternoon sun turned the river into a strip of bronze, and as I drove past the naval yard, the air carried the smell of salt and diesel. It used to comfort me once. Now it only reminded me how every inch of this city belonged to men who thought they built it. The gates of the Officers' Club opened with the same slow groan. The building stood immaculate as ever, white columns catching the last gold of daylight. This was where my father used to bring us after Sunday service, where stories of duty were served between the main course and dessert. Back then, the walls smelled of tobacco and pride. Tonight, it smelled of expensive wine and something colder, expectation. Inside, nothing had changed. The polished floors still echoed like a parade ground, and the portraits of admirals still lined the walls like watchful ghosts. At the head of the long table sat my father, straight-backed, hands folded on the linen as if he were still commanding a ship. His silver hair gleamed under the chandeliers. My mother hovered beside him, smoothing an invisible crease on his sleeve. Across from them, Roland, my brother, leaned back in his chair, his smile the perfect reflection of the man seated at the head. They didn't look up when I arrived. Just a pause in conversation, a polite nod, the kind of acknowledgement reserved for an afterthought. My mother finally rose, air-kissing my cheek, her perfume heavy with something floral and rehearsed. "You look wonderful," she said, though her eyes searched for something to fix. My hair, my jacket, my posture. My father merely lifted his chin. A sailor's greeting turned into ceremony. Then Roland's voice filled the space again. The Pentagon had noticed him. That's how he phrased it. As if the building itself had turned its gaze on him and deemed him worthy. He spoke with the kind of confidence that always came easy to men who never had to fight for space in a room. He went on about his new position, his briefing schedules, the names of admirals who appreciated his insight. I let his words wash over me, dull and constant, like the tide. My father's eyes glinted with approval. "That's what service looks like," he said, his tone carrying more weight than the compliment itself. Not just showing up, but carrying the name. The name. Always the name. I'd spent half my life earning it, and the other half being told I didn't deserve it. The waiter poured another round of wine. Roland finally turned to me, his smile wide enough to sting. "So, Theo, still at the department? Building docks and bridges? Or whatever it is you do?" His tone was light, teasing on the surface, but the mockery ran beneath like an undercurrent. I could feel my father watching me, waiting for the polite answer. "Something like that," I said, keeping my voice even. My father's brow lifted, just slightly. "Not quite the same as wearing a uniform, is it?" He didn't mean to insult me outright. He never needed to. His words always carried that careful sting, the kind that didn't leave a mark anyone else could see. The laughter around the table was soft, polite, deadly. My mother laid her hand on my arm, whispering, "He didn't mean it that way, but he always did." I knew it, and she did too. I nodded, cut another piece of fish, and let the silence swallow what I might have said. The air felt thick with everything that would never be spoken in this family. I'd mastered the art of quiet years ago. It was how I survived them. But sitting there, under those portraits of men who looked like my father and my brother, I felt the familiar pressure in my chest, that mix of ache and anger that came from being erased politely. The conversation drifted back to Roland, his next posting, his strategic potential, his plans in D.C. My mother beamed. My father leaned forward, proud. Their voices blurred together until they became one sound, the steady hum of a family that never noticed the one person sitting outside its circle. I stared down at my glass, watching the candlelight ripple in the red wine. I thought about the nights years ago when I had stood in the engine room of a ship, the floor trembling beneath my boots, alarms screaming, and no one above deck knowing my name. I thought about how close I'd come to not seeing another sunrise. How even after that, when I came home, my father had asked if I'd considered something more stable. Seal. Dinner ended the same way it always did, my father commanding the moment. He raised his glass, and everyone followed. To the men who kept our waters safe, his voice filled the room, solid, proud, final. The clink of crystal echoed like a gavel. I set my glass down before it touched my lips. No one noticed. They never did. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint horn of a ship out on the bay. My father laughed at something Roland said, the kind of laugh that left no space for anyone else. I looked at them, three faces bathed in golden light, content inside their small, perfect story, and felt something sharp twist inside me. A storm doesn't start with thunder. It starts with stillness. And in that stillness, at my father's table, I felt the first pull of the tide turning. I left Charleston before dawn, the highway still wrapped in fog and the air heavy with salt. The silence inside the car was almost a comfort, a kind of numbness that kept the noise of last night from echoing too loudly in my head. Every mile I put between myself and that dinner table felt like shedding another layer of old skin. But some things you carry, no matter how far you drive. The flight to D.C. was short, barely an hour, but it stretched inside me like a decade. I sat by the window, watching the coastline recede into a blur of silver water and cloud. The seatbelt light glowed steady, the hum of the engine constant, and I thought about all the times I'd flown under orders, never for family, always for duty. This trip felt like neither. The envelope in my bag was creased at the corners, its seal unbroken. I'd found it in my mailbox the morning I left, an official invitation from the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. The words were formal, distant, and heavier than they should have been. I hadn't planned on going. I'd told myself I was done with ceremonies, done with being the quiet seat filler in someone else's story. But then, that morning, an email appeared. Rear Admiral Ellis. The subject line, Poseidon Containment, Public Acknowledgement. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Theo, your containment project is scheduled for public acknowledgement. The board may mention your name. You deserve to be there. I read it twice. The words sat heavy in my chest, familiar and foreign all at once. Poseidon. 12 years had passed, but that word still carried the weight of metal and smoke. The Poseidon containment system was supposed to be a small advancement, an engineering safeguard for the Ohio-class submarines stationed in the Pacific. What it became was something else entirely. I'd been the one to find the flaw, buried deep in the design. A pressure valve miscalculated by less than a fraction of an inch. I filed the report, followed protocol, watched it climb the chain of command and vanish somewhere along the way. When the alarm came weeks later, a coolant leak, a reactor nearing failure, I was on duty. There was no time for clearance, no time for permission. I made the call. I overrode the system, sealed the compartment manually. 37 sailors lived. One didn't. His name was Lieutenant Danvers. He'd tried to pull me out before the hatch closed. The blast of steam burned half his body before the shutdown finished. He lasted 12 days. I went to the hospital once, standing by his bed while he slept, the monitors beeping slow and steady. When he woke, he told me I did the right thing. Then he died, and the file disappeared. I was thanked in a small windowless office by a man I'd never met. They handed me a non-disclosure agreement and said the words every officer dreads. Classified. No record of your involvement will exist. And just like that, my career ended where my courage had begun. I left the Navy quietly, took a civilian position at defense engineering, the kind of job that keeps the world running without anyone noticing. I told my family it was logistics. The lie fit neatly in their view of me. Useful, unremarkable, invisible. I looked at Ellis's email again. He'd been the only one who truly knew what happened that night in the Pacific. He'd been commanding the carrier that received the emergency transmission. He'd seen the data, known how close we'd come to losing the entire fleet. Over the years, we'd exchanged brief messages, updates, sometimes silence. He owed me gratitude, I owed him quiet. It was a fair trade. My phone buzzed against the tray table. My mother's name lit up the screen. I hesitated before answering. Her voice was bright, careful, the same tone she used at charity events. Theo, just remember, tomorrow is about your father. Wear something elegant but simple. You know how cameras love faces. I stared at the gray clouds outside. I'll keep it simple, I said. Good girl, she replied. Relieved. Your father will be so proud to have you there. The line went dead. The word proud lingered in the air, hollow and echoing. It was something I'd stopped waiting to hear long ago. Outside the window, Maryland unfolded beneath the plain, flat fields, winding rivers, the dull gleam of the Chesapeake. I tried to picture myself in that hall tomorrow, sitting in the front row while my father's medals caught the light. He would shake hands, deliver his speech about service and legacy, maybe mention Roland's bright future at the Pentagon. If I was lucky, he might glance my way. Remember I existed. The irony wasn't lost on me. They would be celebrating him, the man who carried the name, while the system I built, one that saved the very Navy he served, sat buried in classified files. I pressed a hand over my chest, feeling the thud of my heartbeat against my ribs, the same rhythm I'd felt years ago in that reactor chamber, counting seconds until the temperature dropped, until life returned. Some ghosts never leave. They just learn how to breathe differently. When the plane touched down, the sky had turned the color of pewter. The air was heavy, still. I drove to my apartment in silence, unpacked just enough to find the envelope again, and left it unopened on the counter. Later that evening, I stood by the window, looking out over the Potomac. The city lights flickered in the water, and for a moment, it almost looked like fire. My reflection stared back. Older, sharper, the edges less forgiving than I remembered. I poured a cup of coffee that went cold before I could drink it. The email stayed open on my laptop, the words blurring slightly as fatigue settled in. I could almost hear Ellis's voice. You deserve to be there. Deserve. Another word that meant less than it should. Maybe he was right. Though, maybe I should go. Not for my father, not for the cameras, but for something I couldn't quite name. A reckoning, perhaps. I turned off the lights and walked back to my bedroom. Through the blinds, the skyline glowed faintly, the Capitol dome catching what was left of the sunset. I sat on the edge of the bed, running my thumb over the seam of the unopened envelope, then set it down. I'd spent my whole life keeping things simple, simple enough to disappear, quiet enough to keep the peace. But peace built on silence never lasts. Outside, thunder rumbled over the city, low and distant. I leaned back against the headboard and whispered to the empty room, more to myself than anyone else. Maybe it's time. The storm didn't answer, but I felt it coming. By the time I reached Annapolis, the afternoon light had turned the Severn River into a sheet of glass. The Naval Academy rose on the far bank like a promise carved from white stone, its spires cutting through a sky the color of pewter. Flags lined the entrance road, snapping in the wind with the same rhythm that had once ruled my life. Rows of young officers walked past me, shoes polished bright enough to catch the sun. Their laughter echoed between the columns, clean and confident. I remembered what it felt like to be one of them, years ago, walking these same grounds in coveralls that still smelled of oil and salt, carrying blueprints instead of medals. The streets inside the academy were painfully familiar. Every building looked exactly as it had the last time I was here. Neat, disciplined, incapable of change. I parked near the chapel, where a brass bell hung over the entrance, and walked toward the Naval Library, an old building that always smelled faintly of paper and polish. The guard at the door barely glanced at me. Civilians came and went all the time. Inside, the air hummed with quiet. The corridors were lined with framed photographs, men in uniform shaking hands, launching ships, saluting history. I made my way to the second floor, to the exhibit I'd always avoided. The engineering honor wall stretched along the far end of the hall, bronze panels gleaming under soft lights. Each plaque carried names of those who'd advanced naval technology in some critical way. I'd passed it before, once, years ago, when my work was still buried under clearance codes and sealed files. I hadn't expected to find myself here again. When I stepped closer, the reflection of light off the brass caught my eye and forced me to squint. There it was. Fifth line from the top. Commander Theodora Banks, Civil Engineering Corps, 2021 recipient. My pulse stumbled. The letters felt unreal, too sharp against the metal, as if someone had carved them without permission. I touched the surface, half expecting it to be cold. It wasn't. It was warm from the lamps, from the room's still air, from time itself. So, I'd been here all along. My name had lived here, unnoticed, while my father bragged about the men in our family. 4 years of silence hung between those words on the wall and the people who should have cared to read them. For a moment, I just stood there, surrounded by the ghosts of engineers and officers who had long since been folded into the machinery of history. Then footsteps broke the quiet. A young officer, barely 30, by the look of him, walked by and slowed as he caught sight of me. His eyes flicked from the plaque to my face, then back again. "Ma'am, are you Commander Banks?" he asked. The words careful, respectful. My instructors talked about the Poseidon system. It's an honor. Something inside me tightened. The name of that system still tasted like smoke and steel. I wanted to tell him it wasn't heroism, that it had cost more than anyone ever admitted. Instead, I found myself answering before I could stop it. Not anymore. He smiled. That pure, uncomplicated smile of someone who still believed the Navy was built on fairness. "Once is enough, ma'am." He walked away, leaving me standing in the echo of his words. Once is enough. I stayed there longer than I meant to, watching the light shift on the wall until the letters blurred. For the first time in years, I let myself imagine what it might have felt like if someone, anyone in my family, had seen this plaque when it went up. But they hadn't. They never would have thought to look for me here. By the time I left the building, the sun was sliding down behind the domes of the Academy Chapel. The air smelled of the river and the faint tang of metal. I drove across town to the hotel Ellis's assistant had booked for me, a modest place overlooking the marina. From the window, I could see the masts of small boats rocking gently under the pier lights, the water rippling with gold and gray. The inbox on my phone flashed with a new message. "Tomorrow, Admiral Banks receives his medal after your citation is mentioned." It's poetic symmetry, Ellis had written. Poetic symmetry. The phrase sat like a splinter under my skin. He meant well, I knew that, but there was nothing poetic about having your truth dragged into daylight after years of deliberate erasure. Poetry belonged to those who were allowed to speak. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and walked to the mirror. The reflection that stared back wasn't the one I remembered from my Navy years. The lines at the corners of my eyes were deeper, the gaze harder. I'd built a life outside the uniform, a quiet life that looked steady on paper but felt suspended in midair. Across the room, the dress I'd chosen for the ceremony hung over the chair. Simple black, knee-length, unremarkable. It wasn't the crisp white uniform folded in a box at the back of my closet, with its medals and insignia that would have spoken for me before I opened my mouth. I'd left that uniform behind years ago, folded away with the belief that recognition was something I needed from others. Still, looking at that dress, I felt the weight of what tomorrow would bring: cameras, speeches, applause, things that had never been meant for me. My father's smile would fill the screens, his voice steady as he spoke of legacy, service, sacrifice. My brother would sit beside him, pride gleaming in his eyes, and I would be there, somewhere in the background, the daughter they never learned to see. I ran my fingers along the neckline of the dress, the fabric cool against my skin. There were no medals to pin, no ribbons to align, just me. In the mirror, I whispered to my own reflection, testing the words like a confession. I'm not here to be seen. The thought surprised me, but it was true. I wasn't going to Annapolis to reclaim anything. I wasn't looking for validation from men who could only measure worth in salutes and rank. I was going because erasure, after too long, starts to rot the soul, because sometimes you have to stand in the same room as the people who forgot you and let the truth breathe on its own. Outside, the marina lights flickered. A gull cried somewhere over the dark water. I turned off the lamp, the room plunging into half-light, and stood by the window. The reflection of the harbor shimmered against the glass, overlaying my face with ripples of gold. For a long while, I just watched the tide shift. Somewhere beyond the bridge, ships were docked, silent, resting before another voyage. I wondered if any of them still used the containment system I'd built, the one no one in my family had ever heard about. Maybe that was enough, I thought, to have built something that still worked. Long after the noise had faded, I sat down on the edge of the bed, phone buzzing again with another message, this time from my mother. She didn't need to write much. Her words were always the same. Remember, tomorrow is about your father. Don't draw attention. I smiled faintly. She'd spent her whole life managing appearances, smoothing over rough edges, ensuring we never embarrassed the family name. Even now, she couldn't see that the family name had never needed protecting from me. I typed a reply, then deleted it. There was no point. She wouldn't understand what it meant to be quiet for so long. You forgot the sound of your own voice. The harbor outside gleamed like spilled mercury. The dress waited in the corner. I took one last look in the mirror before turning out the light. The woman staring back didn't look afraid or angry, just certain. Tomorrow, I would walk into that hall not to be seen, but simply to exist, fully, unapologetically, without permission. And for the first time in years, I wouldn't let anyone mistake my silence for absence. The dinner took place in a glass-walled room overlooking the Severn River, where the sunset burned the water in shades of red and copper. Training ships floated in the distance, their reflections trembling against the tide. Inside, the air hummed with conversation and cutlery, the comfortable noise of people who had never known silence the way I had. My father sat at the head of the table, tuxedo pressed sharp, the navy emblem on his lapel catching the chandelier's glow. Even retired, he carried himself like a man still in command, his posture straight, his tone clipped, every movement deliberate. My mother sat beside him, fingers circling the stem of her wineglass, careful not to smudge the lipstick she'd reapplied twice since we'd arrived. Roland, across from me, was already mid-story. Something about his new role at the Pentagon. He had that voice people leaned toward, the kind that filled the room without effort. He named admirals as if they were family friends, described meetings, strategy sessions, dinners with senior officers who saw potential. "They've assigned me to strategic development," he said proudly, his grin so wide it could have cracked the glass behind him. "Dad, the admiral I told you about, he thinks I could be chief of staff in a few years." My father's hand tapped the table in rhythm with his words, a signal of satisfaction. "You're doing what I always hoped for, son, staying the course. The Banks name still means something." That phrase, staying the course, landed in me like a familiar bruise. I'd grown up hearing it, carved on the walls of our house, slipped into toasts, woven into bedtime lessons disguised as conversations about honor. It wasn't advice, it was law. Roland turned his attention toward me, the practiced ease of someone used to holding the spotlight. "So, Theo, still at the department? What is it you actually do there?" The corners of my mouth lifted, polite, measured, infrastructure support, strategic facilities. He laughed, a soft snort through his nose. That sounds bureaucratic. Mom jumped in, smoothing the tension before it had time to grow teeth. She's always been modest. But my father wasn't interested in saving me. He cut across her with a tone that could slice glass. You can't compare the real Navy with civilian contracts. Sweetheart, one's service, the other's support. The words hit like something solid dropped onto the table, invisible but loud. I smiled. Because that's what I'd trained myself to do. I've learned support can keep ships from sinking. Roland threw his head back and laughed, assuming I meant it as humor. That's our Theo, always poetic. Their laughter filled the room. An easy sound. I let it pass through me, the way water passes around stone. I'd spent too long fighting currents that never wanted me to exist in them. The conversation resumed, full of names I knew and stories I didn't belong to. Admirals, command chains, promotions, familiar subjects orbiting the same gravity. The world of men who never doubted their worth. I cut into my meal slowly, listening to the steady clink of knives and forks, the piano music from the corner of the room, a song soft enough to drown out whatever I might have said. No one asked about my work. No one ever did. Out the window, the Severn glowed under the last light. The water looked calm, but I could almost hear the memory of something else beneath it. The rush of steam, the blare of alarms, the metal groan of a hull under pressure. A flash of red light, the heat against my face, the feel of the valve wheel turning under my hand. Then the quiet after, the kind of silence that could split you open. My mother reached for her napkin, smiling toward my father, as if to remind him we were being watched, though no one in the room cared enough to watch us. Roland kept talking, his words a steady current of ambition. My father listened like a general reviewing strategy. Their world fit together so neatly, it left no space for questions. The waiter refilled our glasses. I took a sip of water, cold enough to sting. Then the sound of footsteps approached. A young officer stopped beside our table, crisp in his dress whites, his cap tucked neatly under his arm. His eyes found me, steady and polite. Ma'am, sorry to interrupt. Are you Theodora Banks? The shift was immediate. Every head at the table turned toward me. Yes, I said, my voice even. The officer nodded. Commander Ellis asked me to pass his regards. He said to tell you he'll see you at the ceremony tomorrow. My father's brow tightened, confusion crossing his face. Commander Ellis? The officer corrected him gently. Rear Admiral Ellis. He gave a brief nod of respect. To me, not to my father, and then walked away. The silence he left behind wasn't ordinary. It was heavy, curious, uncomfortable. I could feel my father's gaze on me, sharp and searching. You know Ellis? He asked after a pause. We worked together once. In what capacity? Engineering? Roland laughed under his breath. She builds bridges. Dad? Must have been a sturdy one. The laughter this time was smaller, strained. Even my mother didn't attempt to smooth it. I turned back toward the window. The reflection of the dining room floated over the dark river, my father's proud profile, Roland's grin, my mother's perfect posture, and behind it, the glow of ship lights drifting in the distance. For a moment, the two images blurred together, the calm surface of the water and the chaos that once boiled beneath it. I remembered the sweat dripping down my sleeves, the burning metal beneath my gloves, the hiss of steam as the alarms screamed, the smell of salt and ozone. The moment everything stopped shaking, the first breath of silence after I'd turned that final valve. Support keeps ships from sinking, I'd said. They'd laughed. They still didn't understand. I set my glass down, the sound a small, deliberate note against their chatter. Some bridges don't need to be seen, I murmured. No one heard. Or maybe they did, and pretended not to. The piano kept playing, soft and sweet. The waiter cleared plates that no one had finished. Outside, the Severn darkened, the water folding itself into night. Inside, my family continued their performance, Each line rehearsed, each pause perfectly timed, and I sat among them, smiling just enough to pass. My silence thick as armor, wondering how many more dinners it would take for them to realize I'd stopped needing their applause a long time ago. The room smelled of wine and polish and memory. I let my eyes drift back to the window, where the faint outline of a ship cut across the horizon. Its lights shimmered briefly, then vanished into the dark. That, I thought, is what it means to serve unseen, and I was done pretending they'd ever understand it. The hotel room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioner. I'd left the curtains open, and the lights from the harbor shimmered against the glass, throwing pale reflections across the floor. Annapolis at night always looked cleaner than it really was. Tidy, ordered, every light positioned with naval precision. But beneath that calm, I could feel the pulse of something I'd tried to bury for 12 years. I laid the black dress across the bedspread. The fabric pooled like water, soft, silent, obedient. It was the kind of dress that could disappear in a crowd, just like the woman wearing it. Beside it sat the envelope I'd carried for 2 days, its corner worn smooth from my thumb. The seal of the Department of the Navy gleamed faintly under the bedside lamp. I already knew what it contained. I poured a small glass of bourbon, the good kind I kept for nights when sleep wouldn't come, and sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the bay was alive with the low hum of ships. Across the water, Alumni Hall glowed like a ship run aground, its broad glass panels catching the light of the city. From here, I could see movement inside, cadets rehearsing, adjusting flags, running through their lines for the morning ceremony. The microphone tested. The sound carried across the water in broken bursts. Even muffled, it sounded rehearsed. Perfect. Clean. I took a long sip, let the burn settle, then reached for the envelope. The paper crackled softly when I opened it, a sound far too gentle for what it held. Inside was a single page. Thick. Official. Heavy with the weight of bureaucracy and formality. At the top, in precise blue type, was my name. Commander Theodora Banks, U.S. Navy Civil Engineering Corps, awarded for exceptional service and technical excellence in emergency containment operations. Poseidon Initiative. Below that, the black signature of the Chief of Naval Operations. The date, May 14th, 2021. I traced the letters once with my fingertip, as if the texture could make them more real. So it was true. I'd been given the citation 4 years ago, and no one had told me. Not Ellis, not Command, certainly not my family. The award had gone into the archives, my name etched on a wall I hadn't known existed until yesterday. I stared at the words until they blurred, my pulse echoing in my ears. What I felt wasn't pride. It was something hollower, quieter. Recognition meant nothing if it arrived long after anyone cared to see it. I placed the letter on the table, next to my half-empty glass. The paper looked sterile under the lamplight, like an artifact from a life that had already ended. The phone buzzed. Another email. I didn't need to look to know it was from Ellis. When I opened it, the lines were short, practical, written in the same clipped tone he'd always used. Theo, your father's medal will be presented right after the citation for your project. The board might use your name as the example of technical legacy. I thought you should know. Legacy. The word sat on my tongue like ash. That word had ruled my family for generations. Legacy, service, honor, the holy trinity of the Banks household. Every conversation, every photograph on our walls, every story at the dinner table circled back to those ideas. But legacy, I'd learned, was just another word for inheritance. And inheritance always came with terms and conditions. My father believed in lineage, not contribution. To him, worth was measured in who saluted you, not who you saved. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. All I'd ever wanted was to keep people alive. That was it. Not glory, not titles, just survival. And even that had cost me everything. The memory came in fragments, as it always did. The hiss of the alarms, the rising pitch of metal under pressure, the frantic shouts over the comms. Poseidon Initiative, Reactor Bay 3, pressure critical. The voice had cracked on the last word. I'd read the gauges, done the math, and realized there wasn't time to wait for clearance. My commanding officer's order was to hold position until authorization came from command. If we had, the reactor would have gone critical within minutes. I didn't wait. I broke the seal on the emergency hatch and went in. The heat hit like a wave, the air so thick it burned to breathe. The sound was deafening, the shriek of valves, the pounding of my heartbeat, the alarms that never stopped. I found the manual override and turned it, the metal wheel searing through my gloves. Danvers was there, trying to stop me. Protocol. Commander, wait for the call. He was young, too young to know that sometimes waiting is the same as dying. I shoved him back, finished the turn, felt the sudden drop of pressure, the deep, hollow thud of the system locking down. Then the silence. When I opened my eyes, I saw him on the deck, his uniform blackened, his breathing shallow. I radioed for medics, but by the time they reached us, it was too late. He lasted 12 more days. I visited him once in the medical bay, the room filled with the hum of machines. He could barely speak, but when he saw me, he smiled. You did the right thing. Commander, it was the last thing he ever said to me. They classified the incident, sealed the report, buried everything under operational secrecy. 37 sailors lived, 1 didn't. And that was the math they were willing to live with. I folded the memory away like I always did, the same way I'd folded that letter and tucked it into a drawer when it first arrived years ago. Tonight, though, it felt heavier, like an anchor I'd been carrying too long. The phone buzzed again. This time, a text from my mother. Remember, tomorrow's your father's moment. Try not to draw attention. The laugh escaped before I could stop it. A small, dry sound, more air than humor. I set the phone down and stared at the city beyond the glass. Across the water, the lights of the academy glimmered like a fleet in formation, each one standing at attention, perfect and untouchable. I reached for the letter again, then folded it carefully, sliding it back into the envelope it came in. It looked safer there, contained. Like me. In the corner of my suitcase, tucked inside the pocket of an old jacket, was a watch. I took it out and turned it over in my palm. The casing was scratched, the band frayed, but it still ticked steadily, unfazed by years of neglect. On the back, the engraving was faint but legible. Duty before ego. Danvers's voice echoed in my head, low and steady. You did the right thing. Commander, I whispered into the empty room, the words barely audible over the hum of the city. You'd laugh at this. Danvers. You'd tell me to stop caring who clapped. I set the watch beside the envelope, their metal edges touching like 2 pieces of the same story. Outside, the night deepened. The lights from the harbor flickered, then steadied. Somewhere across the river, I could still hear the faint echo of the rehearsals. The commands shouted, the applause practiced. Tomorrow, the stage would be set, the audience waiting. My father's moment, his medals, his legacy. I switched off the lamp. The room plunged into soft darkness, the city reduced to reflections on the windowpane. Lying back, I let the silence settle around me. It wasn't empty anymore. It hummed. Alive. Charged with something inevitable. Tomorrow, I thought. My silence will meet its echo. And this time, I won't look away. I arrived an hour early. The air was cold and clean, the kind that sharpens every color. Maryland's sky glowed pale blue, the sun still low enough to cast long shadows across the courtyard. From a distance, Alumni Hall looked like a ship run aground, a monument to service and history. Every corner gleamed, every window polished to perfection. Even the silence felt rehearsed. Inside, the hall smelled of brass and floor wax, the scent of discipline and memory. Rows of white chairs stretched endlessly forward, aligned so precisely They looked drawn with a ruler. The flags, the stars and stripes, the Navy ensign, the Academy banner, hung perfectly still in the air-conditioned calm. The place sparkled with order, a shrine built to the idea that legacy was something that could be displayed under lights. My parents were already seated in the front row. My mother adjusted her hem for the third time, her reflection flickering in the polished floor. Beside her, my father sat upright, his posture still military, hands folded, eyes scanning the room like he was commanding it. Roland lounged a few seats away, smiling faintly, the same confident smirk he wore at every family function. I took a seat a few rows behind, close enough to see everything, far enough to be forgotten. When the ceremony began, the band struck up Anchors Aweigh. The brass rang sharp, the drums steady, and the chorus of cadets sang with a pride that made the walls vibrate. I used to sing it too, once, 20 years ago, standing under the deck of a ship, sleeves rolled up, boots slick with oil and salt. I'd sung it softly to myself then, unheard under the roar of engines. The master of ceremonies, a gray-haired man from the Naval Service League, took the stage and welcomed the guests. His voice practiced and bright. He listed dignitaries, awards, sponsors. Then, finally, the moment came. 3 recipients of the Lifetime Naval Service Medal. My father's name was last. My hand trembled slightly on my lap as the first honoree spoke. Then the second. I tried to steady my breathing. The applause rose and fell like tides. And then the MC called for the final recipient, Admiral Walter Banks. The room erupted in applause, steady, respectful, inevitable. My father stood, adjusting his jacket, and walked to the podium with the same firm stride I'd watched my entire childhood. He smiled, gracious, confident, utterly certain of his place in the order of things. When he began to speak, his voice carried easily across the hall. "Service," he said, "isn't a word, it's a lineage. It runs through our veins, through generations of men who answered the call." The words landed heavy, like lead weights dropped into still water. Men who answered the call. The crowd nodded, proud. No one noticed what the sentence erased. But I did. I always did. He spoke of sacrifice, tradition, the call to serve. His tone was steady, composed, the rhythm of a man who'd practiced all his life how to sound worthy. Then he turned toward Roland. "My son, Captain Roland Banks, represents the future of that legacy." I couldn't be prouder. My brother stood, bowing his head slightly as applause filled the room. The light caught his medals just right, every one of them shining like affirmation. My father's eyes softened with approval. Then, as the noise faded, he turned toward me, and my youngest, who— the pause stretched thin and brittle. His eyes flicked toward mine, uncertain for the first time I could remember. The silence cracked. Then he forced a smile. "Is here tonight." A weak ripple of applause followed, polite but cold. My mother smiled too brightly, clapping her hands just enough to fill the space. I sat still, lips curved in a line that wasn't quite a smile. I'd lived my whole life inside that pause, between who and is here tonight. He continued his speech, words blurring into the hum of my heartbeat. I thought it would end there, one more evening of elegant silence. But fate, or something like it, had other plans. From the back of the hall came a young man's voice, loud enough to cut through the quiet. "Excuse me, Admiral Banks." Every head turned. A junior officer stood near the rear wall, papers in his hand. His uniform was spotless, his expression hesitant but clear. "Sir, apologies for interrupting, but your daughter's name is already on that wall. 2021 recipient." The words hung in the air. The silence that followed wasn't ceremonial. It was the kind that rearranged a room. My father turned, slow and deliberate, his eyes following the officer's gaze. There, lit by a soft golden spotlight. The engraved letters gleamed across the bronze. Commander Theodora Banks, Civil Engineering Corps, Poseidon Containment Initiative, 2021. A murmur swept through the crowd. then stopped, as if everyone had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Someone near the aisle whispered, "Oh my God!" A chair scraped the floor. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Roland's face went pale, his smile collapsing into disbelief. I didn't move. I just sat there, the way you do when a storm finally breaks over a sea you've been watching your whole life. Then another voice, low, steady, unmistakable. Rear Admiral Ellis was walking toward the stage, his uniform gleaming white under the lights. He looked out at the crowd, then at my father. For those unaware, Commander Banks designed the Poseidon Containment System, the system that prevented a reactor meltdown off Guam 12 years ago. She received her citation under classified status. Whispers rippled through the room, a collective realization moving like current. My father gripped the podium. "That can't be." Ellis met his gaze. "It's on record, sir. She's one of the finest engineers we've ever had." The oxygen seemed to drain from the hall. Every sound faded until I could hear my own heartbeat in the stillness. My father turned toward me, confusion and pride and shame colliding behind his eyes. Roland stood abruptly, his voice cracking through the silence. "That's impossible. She's a civilian." Ellis didn't even blink. She was Navy, captain, commander rank. She served. The spotlight caught me full in the face, blinding and warm. I felt every gaze turn toward me, hundreds of strangers seeing me for the first time. I stood, my voice calm, almost detached. "Please, Admiral Ellis, let him finish his speech." He hesitated, then gave me a small nod. But it was too late. No one in that room was listening to Walter Banks anymore. The words he tried to speak fell flat, swallowed by the truth now written in metal and memory. For the next few minutes, the ceremony turned into something else, a quiet undoing. The man who had always defined legacy now stood beneath it, stripped bare by it. And I, his forgotten daughter, sat beneath the same light that once refused to find me. When the applause finally returned, polite and confused, it sounded hollow. My father stepped down from the podium and walked past me without a word. I didn't stop him. I didn't need to. Truth doesn't arrive to punish. It arrives when denial runs out of places to hide. And that night, under the cold lights of Alumni Hall, there was nowhere left. The lights were still on long after the ceremony ended. The applause had faded, but the air still vibrated with the aftershock of what had just happened. People moved in small groups toward the exits, their voices low but urgent, carrying fragments of my name like stray currents. That's her. She was the engineer. God. Imagine her father. Their whispers followed me through the aisle like ripples breaking across still water. I kept my head high, hands steady at my sides, though I could feel their eyes pressing against me. Curiosity, surprise, respect, pity. It all sounded the same. At the edge of the room, my mother found me first. Her eyes were red, her lipstick smudged at one corner. She reached for me, fingers trembling. "Theo!" I touched her arm before she could say more. "It's all right. Mom!" "He didn't know," she said, voice trembling. "He truly didn't?" I nodded once. "I know." When I looked past her, I saw my father standing alone near the exit. The medal still hung from his hand, its ribbon tangled between his fingers. The stage lights hit the silver edge and cast a faint shimmer across his face, but it couldn't hide the expression underneath. Bewilderment. Disbelief. The hollow look of a man seeing a reflection he didn't recognize. He wasn't looking at anyone. Not the crowd, not my mother, not even at me. Just the floor. I walked toward him slowly, the sound of my heels echoing through the nearly empty hall. "Dad?" He didn't turn around. His voice came low, ragged. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I did," I said quietly. "Years ago. You told me it wasn't real service." He shut his eyes, his shoulders shifting, as though the weight of the metal had suddenly doubled. "I didn't know, no." I cut him off gently. "You didn't want to." The silence between us stretched so wide, I could hear the faint hum of the lights above. Behind me, Roland's voice rose, sharp with anger. He was arguing with someone. Ellis. Maybe. I caught fragments of it. She humiliated him in front of everyone. The irony of it struck me so hard I almost laughed. I turned back to my father. I didn't come here to humiliate anyone. I said, I came because you asked me to be here. He didn't answer. My mother moved closer, her hand finding mine. Please, Theo, don't make this worse. I shook my head. I'm not making anything. I'm just standing. The words hung there, simple, steady, final. I stepped away before anyone could stop me. The hall's double doors loomed ahead, still half open, the night spilling through them in cool waves of air. When I pushed them open fully, the wind from the Severn hit my face, cold, metallic, alive. The world outside was sharp and unfiltered. Street lamps glowed along the walkway, their light fractured in the rippling water below. Behind me, the sound of the ceremony unraveling filled the air, chairs scraping, muffled laughter, trying to stitch normalcy back together. The MC's voice carried faintly, an attempt to restore order. But the tide had already turned. I walked down the steps, the echo of my footsteps against the marble rhythmic and clear. Then I heard my name. Ellis was waiting near the edge of the plaza, his cap tucked under his arm, expression tight with something between apology and admiration. That wasn't how I wanted it to happen, he said quietly. Neither did I. You held yourself well. I smiled faintly. I've had practice. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and unfolded a single sheet of paper, offering it to me. For your record, he said, the Deep Selection Board is reviewing your file. You're being considered for flag officer. If you want it. I took the paper, but didn't open it. My fingers brushed the edge, feeling the embossed seal beneath the streetlight. Then I looked past him, out toward the dark river. I'm tired, I said finally. Tired of fighting for seats in rooms that don't see me. He studied me for a moment, then said softly, Then maybe it's time they do? I looked back at him, a small laugh escaping me. Not bitter, just weary. Or maybe it's time I stopped needing them to. He gave a slow nod, understanding in his eyes. Then he stepped aside, letting me pass. I kept walking. Each step across the marble plaza sounded like metal striking stone. Clean, deliberate, final. The kind of sound you hear at the end of something long overdue. Behind me, the murmurs continued inside the hall, but they no longer belonged to me. When I reached the edge of the courtyard, I stopped and looked out across the Severn. The wind lifted the ends of my hair, carrying the scent of salt, steel, and rain. The lights from the bridge shimmered across the surface, streaks of gold against black water. For the first time in years, I felt the weight in my chest ease, not because anyone had recognized me, but because I no longer cared if they did. I drew in a breath deep enough to hurt, let it out slowly, and watched it vanish into the cold night air. The world was still turning, the tide was still coming in, and somewhere in the quiet between one breath and the next, I understood. My life had shifted course, not because anyone had given me permission, but because I'd finally stopped asking for it. I left Alumni Hall close to 9. The crowd had already thinned, black suits and white uniforms scattering like startled birds returning to the dark. The courtyard was washed in gold light, quiet except for the low hum of engines from cars pulling away and the faint whistle of a ship somewhere on the Severn. I followed the narrow path toward the back of the building, where the river wind carried the scent of salt and exhaust. My heels clicked softly against the bricks. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy, uneven. Theo, his voice, hoarse, cracked, was no longer the one that used to command attention across a deck. I turned. My father stood beneath a street lamp, the metal still pinned to his lapel, though the ribbon was twisted, as if it had been handled too much. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Why didn't you tell me? I met his eyes. I did. He frowned. The kind of frown he used when something didn't fit the story he believed about himself. When? Years ago. You said it wasn't real service. You said I was helping, not serving. He drew a sharp breath. The muscle in his jaw twitched. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know. No, I said softly. You didn't want to. The silence that followed was heavier than anything he'd said all night. For the first time, I saw him without the armor. No uniform, no command voice. Just a man realizing he'd been blind in his own house. He looked down at the medal. You should have worn your uniform. And steal your moment? It was never about moments, wasn't it? We stood there, the distance between us both too close and too far. A father and daughter. Two people fluent in duty, but foreign to each other's truth. I took a step forward, lowering my voice. You built ships, Dad. I built what kept them from burning. We both served. We just did it differently. He inhaled, shaky, his shoulders sagging as if something inside him had come undone. His eyes glistened, but no words came. I reached out and rested a hand on his shoulder. The fabric of his tuxedo was stiff beneath my fingers. It's okay, I said quietly. You don't have to understand everything. Just remember I was there too. He nodded, barely, his throat working like he wanted to speak but couldn't. I stepped back and left him there under the lamplight. A man who'd once carried the weight of a nation and now struggled to carry his own regret. Behind him, the reflection of the medal flashed briefly, then dimmed. By the time I reached the parking lot, the night had turned colder. The wind off the river sliced through the stillness, and for the first time all day, I felt free to breathe. The drive back to the hotel was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows an explosion. The streets were nearly empty, lined with trees that cast long shadows across the road. I rolled the window halfway down. The air smelled of wet leaves and salt water. When I stepped into the room, my phone was already buzzing. 3 missed calls from my mother, 2 messages from Roland. I set my purse down and unlocked the screen. Roland. You made him look like a fool. Roland. You always wanted to prove something. Well, congratulations. I stared at the words until the anger drained out of them. Then I placed the phone on the table, unopened bourbon bottle still where I'd left it that morning, and walked to the window. I unlatched it. The cold wind rushed in, carrying the faint clang of halyards against masts and the metallic echo of the shipyard beyond the bridge. The phone rang again. Mom. I almost ignored it, but after 10, maybe 15 attempts, I picked up. I'm here, I said. Her voice was small, tight. He hasn't spoken in hours. He's devastated. He didn't know. I believe that. Then why did you let it happen this way? Outside, the lighthouse blinked red every few seconds, slow and steady, the same rhythm it had kept for decades. Because I got tired, I said. Tired of shrinking myself to fit the story you all wrote for me. There was only breathing on the other end. Then, finally, she whispered, we never meant to hurt you. Intent doesn't erase impact. The words came out quiet but sharp, trembling at the edges. Do you know how many times I tried to tell you? I said. Every time. The conversation turned back to Dad or Roland. I learned to stop trying. Silence is easier than shouting into a wall. A faint sob broke through the line. He wants to talk to you. Not tonight. Theo, please, Mom, I love you. But I need to breathe before I talk again. I ended the call before she could answer. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the open suitcase by the dresser. Inside, the citation letter still rested in its envelope. I took it out and unfolded it, tracing my name under the dim light. The paper glowed pale gold, the words as impersonal as ever. All this time, I thought I was invisible. I murmured, turns out, I was just classified. I folded the letter carefully and placed it next to the old Navy watch on the nightstand. The second hand kept ticking, soft, steady, unbothered by the noise of the world. I turned off the lamp. The room sank into darkness, except for the faint red reflection of the lighthouse flickering across the ceiling. It pulsed like a heartbeat, slow, patient, alive. And for the first time in years, I realized that was enough. 3 days later, I was back in Washington. The city was gray with drizzle, the kind that blurred the outlines of buildings and softened the sound of traffic. That morning, a knock came at my door. When I opened it, the mail carrier handed me a cream-colored envelope, the handwriting across the front shaky but unmistakable, from Walter Banks. I stood there for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a printed photograph, the honor wall at Annapolis. My name glimmered in the light, etched forever in bronze. Beneath it, a short note written in my father's uneven scrawl. Theo, I built ships. You built safety. I was too proud to notice the difference. I'm sorry. That was all. No excuses, no preamble. Just the truth stripped bare, unadorned. I don't know how long I stood there holding that letter, staring at the words until the ink seemed to blur. Something inside me loosened, not with anger, but with release. All those years of being the shadow in the room, the quiet seat at the table, the name left unspoken. Suddenly, it all felt small beside one simple acknowledgement. I set the photograph on the desk beside Danvers's old watch. The second hand kept moving, patient and steady. Maybe he finally heard me. I thought, not through words, not through proof or pride, but through the quiet sound of something still ticking after the storm. A week later, I returned to Norfolk. The air smelled of salt and iron, and the new research vessel gleamed under the morning sun, smaller than any destroyer I'd ever worked on. But somehow, it felt more human, designed not for war, but for endurance. I stepped onto the deck, boots echoing against the steel. The team was already at work, running checks and calibrations. A young engineer approached, barely out of the academy, his face flushed with the kind of nervous respect that once used to make me uncomfortable. "Morning, ma'am. I read about you in the academy bulletin. The Poseidon system, that was you, right?" I smiled. "Part of me. The rest was a team that never got credit." He hesitated, then asked quietly, "Did it really save the fleet?" I looked out toward the horizon, where sunlight broke across the rippling surface of the water. "It saved something bigger," I said. "It saved us from ourselves." He nodded, unsure what to say next, and went back to work. I stayed there, watching the sea shift between blue and silver, remembering my father's letter, forgiveness. I realized, isn't about forgetting, it's about refusing to let the past name you. That evening, as the tide began to rise, I sat on the pier and opened my laptop. The glow of the screen lit my face while I typed a short email to my mother. "Tell Dad I got his letter. I'll call when I'm ready. No signature, no explanation." I closed the laptop and listened to the sound of the waves slapping gently against the hull. For the first time in years, there was no pressure to respond, no need to be understood. The tide kept moving, calm and certain, and somewhere between the rhythm of the sea and the ticking of the old watch in my pocket, I understood. This was what peace sounded like. Dawn in Norfolk arrived like a whisper, soft, gray, and full of mist. I stood on the deck of the new research vessel, its steel hull still smelling faintly of paint and salt. The horizon stretched open before me, a thin line of fire where the sun began to rise, turning the water gold for just a moment before the light settled into calm. The ship hummed beneath my feet, alive and waiting. The morning wind brushed past, cool and briny, tugging gently at my hair. Somewhere out in the distance, a patrol boat cut across the bay, its wake a pale scar on the otherwise glassy sea. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw his name. "Dad, your name's beside mine now. On the academy record. I thought you should know." For a long moment, I stared at the screen, the glow of it faint in the morning light. Then I typed back slowly, "No, Dad. Let it stand alone. It belongs where it is." I slipped the phone away and leaned on the rail. The wind rose again, carrying the faint cry of gulls and the smell of diesel from the harbor. Out beyond the breakwater, the sails of small boats began to unfurl, white triangles catching the early sun. We both served. I whispered into the breeze. That's enough. The words disappeared into the wind, carried toward the open sea, and with them went the last trace of the weight I'd been carrying all these years. There were no cameras here, no ceremony, no applause, just the steady rhythm of the ocean and the quiet pulse of an engine preparing to leave shore. I rested my palm against the cold steel of the railing, feeling the heartbeat of the vessel beneath it, a slow, patient thrum that matched my own. The ship began to move, pulling gently away from the dock. The water rippled in its wake, catching the sunlight in fleeting shards. I watched the coastline slip farther behind me, the buildings turning small and the horizon widening until it felt infinite. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to look back. The light was ahead now, spilling across the sea, and I knew, without question, that I was sailing toward the right direction.